Hi there. It is story time with Dr. Bird. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. Thank you for being here, and thanks for your interest in what I'm talking about. I am a biblical scholar, and I am interested in essentially bringing critical thinking to meet reading the Bible. And I do that through the work I do teaching intro courses online and through this kind of thing being videos on YouTube. This happens to be live, but I also have some that I record and do just a little bit of editing for, and I release those once a week in a series called Does the Bible Tell You So? This is a series, this live stream that I'm doing for the rest of June, and then I think I'm going to keep doing after June on Tuesdays and Thursdays, is a chance to look at biblical passages that talk about or touch on some form of sex, the relationships we refer to as marriage, or that have an example of physical harm taking place that involves intimate body parts. So I use that particular language to say I don't like the juxtaposition of sexual and assault, because I think of one as good and one as bad. And so putting them together feels rather dissonant for me. So I've been doing that, and I worked through the book of Genesis. Now we're into Matthew, and then we'll go back to some Hebrew Bible stories next. And so what I thought I would do today is look at the three passages that remain in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is doing some sort of conversation. He's touching on the relationship we call marriage in some way, shape, or form. And as I noted yesterday, I think at the beginning, there really aren't a lot of passages in the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is attributed with saying anything at all about marriage, this relationship we call marriage. And I think in and of itself, I think that is important to note, that this guy, Jesus, is pretty important for Christians. And if you pronounce that particular faith, or if you even kind of identify with it gently or remotely, I think it's relevant to point out how little Jesus actually says about marriage. I think it's important to point out that he never ever speaks positively of it. He never endorses it. He doesn't give advice about marriage. He doesn't say anything positive about it. In fact, we're going to look at 3 short passages today, and in none of them does it seem that he's all that excited about the institution of marriage. That doesn't mean he's down on it by any means, but the elements in these stories, I think, are actually really striking if you take a moment to reflect on them. What these things attributed to Jesus actually say about what a Jewish man in the first century might have thought about marriage. And he is particularly not so pro-family, which is another thing that I think is really important for people today to be aware of. If you are a follower of this guy named Jesus, who is called the Christ, and you are a family values kind of person, I'm not judging that you are, but I think it's interesting that Jesus really isn't, because he tells men to cut off their balls if they can handle it. He never speaks positively. He tells men they can leave their families. Family values, like, that's not on his radar, at least not in the depiction of him. So I think that's relevant. I think that's really important today, because I think that if people want to be all pro family values, that's great. But Jesus doesn't get to be your guy for that. I think we need to be honest about that as a starting point. Okay. So we're looking at 3 passages in Matthew. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 27, Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 23, and then that first parable or story in chapter 25 of Matthew. Now, I also have one of my favorite books. As a professor and a teacher of biblical studies intros, I love this book, The Gospel Parallels, a comparison of the synoptics, because, and there are versions that put all 4 gospels side by side, but that does a slightly different thing. This one's really fun to me. It was a book I was assigned in one of my undergraduate courses 30 years ago, and just had lunch with that professor a few months ago. And what it does is it shows you regardless of which way you make sense of the synoptic problem, which is actually just a synoptic issue. I don't think it's a problem, it's a reality. But regardless of how you make sense of the synoptic reality, which is to say, there are places where the three synoptic gospels overlap each other, and there are places where they differ from each other. So they might start off the same story, kind of on the same wording, and then they diverge pretty quickly at times or whatever. And one will have content that the others just kind of leave out. It's kind of a curiosity, really. But this helps you see that in real time. So I like to bring it into conversations. It's not like it's super relevant to this conversation about marriage, but the reason I'm bringing it up is to highlight that there are so few passages in the Gospels that do talk about marriage. So few times when Jesus is talking about it. And if you look at the parallels, the fact that there's one story, say we're looking at Matthew 19, right? So Matthew 19, 27 and following has this thing where Peter says this comment. Well, if you want to be clear about things, you wouldn't count the version in Mark and the version in Luke as two additional times that he says it. Those are just two other places where the same basic story is shared. So that just counts as one time. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's why I brought out the parallel, is to show you that these ideas are not, that we're going to look at Matthew 22, this thing where they pose a question about the resurrection. And that shows up in all three synoptics. That's not three times Jesus says it. That's one time. And they do just a little bit, something different at the end, each of the three, but they all have it. So that's just one instance. Do you see what I'm saying? So there really just are very few times when Jesus talks about marriage, divorce, or adultery in the Gospels. Super important, in my opinion, for you to be aware of that. So I'm not going to refer back to this anymore because that feels more like a New Testament intro. And this is more about story time on these passages that are of interest. At least they are to me. Okay, we're going to stop that thing from... I'm going to just do some story time now without the little ticker tape across the bottom. So we're in chapter 19 of Matthew. And this is really at the end of, they've asked questions. So in Matthew 19, we talked about this a couple days ago because it has the passage about for which reason do you allow divorce? And they have that whole exchange, and it ends with Jesus throwing the gauntlet that whoever can handle it should go chop off your balls, right? Go remove your testicles. And so they're going, then what must I do to have eternal life is the follow-up to that, which is an interesting thing. And well, there's that thing about children, letting the children come to him. And then someone comes and says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Very interesting follow-up to this thing about divorce and him endorsing eunuchs. And then Jesus said to his disciples, so it's down in verse 23 of chapter 19, truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they've been hearing some big stuff today. When they heard this, they were greatly astounded and said, then who can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals, it is impossible, but for God, all things are possible. Perhaps they're also missing part of the point that Jesus is talking about, which is not the point for our series, but the idea of the kingdom of God is actually coming here, not getting into heaven. But that's a whole nother thing. Then Peter said in reply to all this, right? Look, we've left everything and followed you. What then will we have? Right? Like, what are we going to get for being so devoted to you, Jesus? Right? And Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That little section is particular to Matthew. Matthew is really interested in showing Jesus's righteousness, his heavy connection to his Jewishness, his scriptures, his Jewish culture, all of those things. So that little thing and the 12 tribes, all that's very Jewish. And you don't see that in Luke and Mark's version. But what you do see is what's next, which is, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my name's sake, blah, 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 which isn't the important part. My intention here is to highlight the fact that he's just listed all the relationships in a nuclear family. Interestingly enough, Matthew and Mark leave out wives or women. Luke is the only one that mentions the spouse. I don't want to make a bigger deal of that than necessary right now. I just think it's interesting. Anyone who has left behind their life, their possessions, their family relationships, their spouse, their fields will get such and such. I had an exchange with someone a few years ago she was at the time of a young evangelical married woman. She was quite young and newly married. And I tried to say something to her about, about this idea of Jesus. This is when I first started trying to do conversations around what the Bible says about marriage. Because I think it's a helpful place for us to start in this culture to be able to talk about what the Bible does and does not say on the topic. And so, of course, I got the attention of a lot of evangelicals and conservatives when I'm trying to talk about the Bible doesn't actually say what you think it does. And I got into an exchange with a young woman who said she'd be fine if her husband left her to go follow Jesus. If Jesus called him to do something for the ministry, called for the kingdom, she would be fine with him leaving her behind. And, at the time, I simultaneously absolutely understood what she meant and absolutely thought she was full of BS because she didn't know what it was going to be like to have two children, for instance, whether or not she was working to bring in income, I don't know. And that for her husband to just decide he's going to go off and do this thing. Like, I don't think she actually knew what that would be like. But in theory, she was down with it because it's what Jesus says you should be able to do, or that you'd be blessed even more so if you were willing to do these things to follow him. So when you're very committed to what scripture says, you will say something like that to a person like me who means well and is trying to get you to think critically about things, right? I know that she really believed that when she said that. And I do not question that she said it because of her faith in Christ or her faith in Jesus. But I do not believe if that had happened, she would actually be okay with it. Or she might at first, and she might put up a good front or whatever. Or she, you know what, maybe I'd be proved wrong and she'd be totally fine with it. And she'd move in with somebody and whatever, I don't know, make it work and she'd be fine with it. But I'm having a hard time, So, it's so fascinating. All these ideas are in here in this collection called the Bible. So, I'm not trying to make a definitive stance about this. I'm trying to invite you to think about it. What does it mean, or what does it tell you that Jesus does actually say this about, that it's somewhat related to this relationship called marriage, that he says, those of you who leave behind your families and your belongings and your lifestyle, your livelihood or whatever, and follow me are going to be blessed. You'll inherit eternal life. Like, what does that say to you about how Jesus does or does not value marriage? And I can already hear it coming up in the comments or now or later is, well, but if Jesus had an apocalyptic worldview, then what does that mean for him? And so let me just address that briefly. I'm torn over that, of what to make of, to what extent Jesus would have had an apocalyptic worldview, partly because we really can't know. I think that an apocalyptic belief system is important for people to understand well before we have any kind of a conversation about whether or not Jesus had that. And I think in the first century, for a Jewish person to have an apocalyptic worldview, it had all kinds of components of God is coming down to earth to eradicate our oppressors and to set up a just kingdom here on earth. Like, I think that's a conversation I would want to have to be able to do that well. and that would all make sense in a certain way of looking at things and a certain way of making sense of a Jewish man around the year 30 going to Jerusalem to try to take it to the man and being squelched for it. Like, all these pieces can kind of fall into place and make sense. I don't actually need Jesus to have had an apocalyptic worldview in order to read all these things. Um, I think for some people, why they raise that question is, well, if he did have a short time frame in mind as he's saying these things, or someone is attributing it to him, then that would make a little bit more sense why he doesn't really care about and doesn't say positive things about a family, because it's just, we're just doing this for a few more years, and then, you know, the heavens are going to open up and God's going to visit the planet and set everything right. So on a certain level, that makes sense to me. But the reality is, we're here 2,000 years later, and people are still turning to those ideas fully out of context. So regardless of what it actually meant, what it says to me is that wasn't a priority for him. It wasn't important to him to underscore, support, reinforce marriages. So we're just not dealing with a guy who's here, who was trying to support and underscore and like, make family the central thing in this movement, because he wasn't. And we don't know if he would have or not had he thought we'd still be here 2,000 years. We don't know. And so what we do have are words that imply he wasn't terribly concerned about endorsing the family. Right? Are you tracking with me on this? Maybe I'm just being a little bit too slick. I don't know. Trying to make, have my cake and eat it too. I don't know. But I think that what I do care about is, these are the words we have to work with for those of you for whom this is an important collection. And so let's talk about what they are saying, what they're not saying, and then you can figure out what to do with them, right? Okay. So, let me see. I thought I was over on the comments so that I could see what people were saying. Okay. You all are having a little chit chat. Okay. Is there a reference to slavery here? In the one, no, not in 19, but there is in the chapter 25. Is it references like that earthly slavery severed family ties and personal autonomy, and following Jesus does the same as slaves? JC, I'm not sure if I'm following your questions. The story in chapter 25 that we're going to talk about does refer to slaves, or indirectly to slavery in the enslaved people's lifestyles. Oh, yeah. Okay. So maybe I'm understanding and maybe I'm not. I'm not sure, but I do want to make sure that we circle back to that to address it if it's not addressed by the end of the conversation today. So let's get over very quickly to, I think this one, again, this was just a subtle shift for me as I was doing the research for the Bible, for the book that I have coming out this fall, Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? Which is a parallel, and it parallels the same when the video series that I've created for people, primarily for people of faith who want to keep their faith and know what to do with the Bible on this topic. That's what the video series, Marriage in the Bible, a discussion among friends, that's what that series was created to do. And so it's the same topics in the book, but the book can go deeper on each topic, and it is for a general audience, whereas the videos are for people of faith who don't want to give up their faith, but also want to know what to do. Okay. I lost my train of thought there. Oh, so for that book, as I was reading, there's a chapter in the book on Newer Testament references, right? So not just Matthew 19, 4-6, but also all the other passages in the Newer Testament that refer to marriage, and there's not that many. And as I engage this question, this one that we're reading next, it is in all three synoptics, primarily handled the same way. So I'm just going to read Matthew's version just because that's where I am right now, but they're very similar. And the headings in the Bible usually say something about the question of the resurrection, because that's the question that's being asked. So what I want to pose to you before I read it is, notice whose life is being used as an example to get at this issue. what whose lives whose lives are being referenced in these stories? Who are we using, metaphorically speaking, in order to make a point or in order to have an argument? And it's fascinating to me how many times women, enslaved peoples, maybe sex workers, or, in John chapter 8, we'll get to that at some point, right? People on the margins, people who don't have a voice, women keep coming up as the people that the stories are pointing at for to make a point, which I just think is really interesting. And I don't have a huge takeaway on this, except I wanted to point it out to you to encourage you or to invite you to think about it. So Matthew 22, over in verse 23. The same day, so they had this whole conversation about stories that I think ought to be read as critiques of the way people behave, but Newer Testament scholars don't agree on how to read some of these stories, right? The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. I think that Jesus is contrasting. This is how kings of this earth behave, and it's awful, and that's in contrast to the kingdom of heaven. Some say that this is how God behaves, and that this is how you should expect God to behave, so get your shit in line, kind of a thing. Either one really works because, one is saying he's critiquing the way people behave here, and it's near the end of the gospel, and so that makes sense that he'd be telling stories to critique the people in Jerusalem who have a lot of money and power and who throw parties and stuff. So to me, that makes more sense. The other is interesting to me, as long as everybody understands that when people are saying this is how God behaves, that we're actually slightly terrified of that. That shouldn't be a God that you want to worship. I just think it's really interesting that we can have such very different takeaways on the same stories. So we have that story, and then we have the one about the Pharisees. We know that you're sincere. Should we pay taxes or not? Those are all related, and that's why I think we should be reading that first story in chapter 22 as a critique. But anyway, so after those two exchanges, we get this story according to the narrative. The same day, some Sadducees came to him, saying, now Sadducees are people who did not believe in the resurrection, right? Pharisees did, Sadducees did not. So some Sadducees came to him, saying, there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, teacher, Moses said, quote, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother, end quote, which isn't actually a quote, but they're paraphrasing. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless. You can say married in the Newer Testament because there is a verb for to marry. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same. So also the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose woman of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. I cannot tell you when it was that I first actually just stopped to consider this story from the position of the woman they've just referenced. I don't remember how old I was, but it's disturbingly late in life. Before I actually just stopped to consider being that woman, being forced to be married to 7 brothers, one after the other. But it's just a story to make a point. Yeah, well, actually, given its location in a sacred canon, I don't know that it's just a story. It's telling us something about the people at the time and the way they viewed human beings, and really almost saw women as disposable. Or this is at the very best, at the worst, perhaps it's flippant about this possible reality, in order to get to a point, in order to try to get Jesus into a place where they could catch him in some sort of tortured, confusion about what is true and right or whatever. I don't know. What's my point here? When was, if you grew up with these stories, right? Do you remember when you actually took seriously and tried to consider what this part of the story would have been like to be that woman? I don't care what gender you are. Did you ever? Have you ever? Do you remember, how old were you when you did? Because that's part of what that's part of what faith communities do, is they keep us from really sinking our teeth into those disturbing realities, that they're using what would be, I think it's fair to say, traumatic, a pretty traumatic reality for a female, for this woman. And I don't deny that it would be difficult and challenging for those brothers for different, very, very different reasons, right? But it's amazing to me how casual they can be about, or even crass about it. So what's then, to follow that up then, is of interest to me, is the way Jesus responds to this levirate marriage scenario. And it seems to me we should maybe call it something other than marriage, because the only instance of it being referred to in the Bible is in Genesis 38. And actually Judah says to his second son, perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. He's not even actually marrying her. Maybe by the time we get to Jesus's day, they actually talked about it as marrying instead of just remaining a brother-in-law and just having sex with your brother's woman. But maybe that was a part of progression there. But notice how Jesus responds, regardless of how we refer to this practice. Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God." Phew, glad we got that figured out. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? Quote, I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and the God of Jacob. End quote. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. So he does not acknowledge the life situation of the woman. He doesn't acknowledge this, what I would be really surprised to see people embracing today, practice of levirate marriage. He doesn't say that that needs to be undone. He doesn't say this is a really outdated way of handling lineage and inheritance rights. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say anything about the actual relationships that this whole scenario is built upon. And he's jumping in and, you know, I don't know if he's even really addressing their question. Maybe he is. He tends not to do that in John, but he does tend to answer it a little bit, even if obliquely, in the Synoptics. You were wrong. He doesn't set a great example for arguing or for having conversation exchanges about ideas, I guess. Because coming right out of the gate saying you were wrong is not a good way to invite conversation. But anyway, you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Again, in context, Jesus is having these crazy battles. He's being shown to go head to head with Pharisees and Sadducees and men and scribes and men associated with the temple. Because of the political and economic issues he has with them. But if you're not aware of that dynamic in the background, you might think that he's being anti-Judaic. He's being anti his own leaders purely because they're his own leaders, instead of because of the political and economic realities undergirding the dynamic that he's frustrated with, just like the Hebrew Bible prophets were frustrated. So, he doesn't really address the issue for the people, but he does try to say that they've got it all mixed up, or that they don't understand. I don't know that he's even trying to explain whether or not there is a resurrection. I think he's just trying to get away from addressing either part. Excuse me. And then I also want to remind you one more time when he quotes in verse 32, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Actually, he's the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaac and Rebekah, the God of Jacob and Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah, because those dudes didn't get to have children without the women at their side. And it drives me crazy that we continue to talk about the God of these men instead of the God of the couples that were involved. Drives me crazy. Okay. The other passage is the one in Matthew 25. So let me see if there are any comments, questions, interesting commentary about angels. What if you don't want my brother's woman? Exactly, Daryl. I'm with you. What if you don't want to marry her? What if you don't want to have sex with her? Right? Totally get that. And all kinds of things, right? What if you didn't want to marry at all? What if you're into dudes? Like all of the things, right? Yeah. All of the things. So none of that scenario seems terribly fair, but also I think we've in general said that's really not a practice we want to endorse anymore. But Jesus doesn't seem to have a problem with it. That's my main point in highlighting this story. The issue of levirate marriage is brought to Jesus. He neither addresses the reality of the situation for people and nor acknowledges that it's kind of a jacked up practice, right? They're two separate things, because that scenario is with a woman being forced to marry 7 different brothers. Good God, that's awful, right? And then just the practice itself is, I think, all due respect, worthy of being kicked to the curb, right? Like, we have other ways of dealing with inheritance and who we want to have what in our lives. Okay. Right? Okay. So one other passage, and it's not even about marriage. It's about a story tangentially related, and that's as close as we get to Jesus saying anything about marriage. So I think I'm actually just going to very briefly refer to it instead of spending a lot of time reading it and talking about it. Chapter 25 opens with a parable or a story. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. And in contrast to the other stories, it seems to me, this is a little bit more clear that this is what the kingdom of, this is a clear, much clearer story, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other Newer Testament scholars, that Jesus is saying this is how God is going to behave, and this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And what it boils down to is this issue of being watchful, being aware at all times, and looking for the kingdom of heaven to come, or whatever. And what is pretty disturbing to me, and I appreciated the way my colleague Mitzi J. Smith engages this particular story in her work. I will. I thought about it ahead of time. I just didn't have time to get to it ahead of time. Mitzi's article, I can actually make that available. Put a link to it in the description. Very helpful engagement with the story, because the reality of what's being described for the women, these 10 women, they're called 10 bridesmaids in the New Revised Standard Version. In the updated version, I think they revert back to calling them virgins, because that's what's being described. Is in the Greek, it's 10 virgins. But ultimately, the thing is, some of them are being watchful and well prepared, and some of them are being depicted as being not well prepared. And those are the ones who don't get to participate in the kingdom of heaven, or whatever, the party at the end of the night. So that in and of itself is the basic idea. What's being said is some of these people are lazy or not well prepared, and you're not getting involved. You don't get to participate. What's also being said at the same time is a ridiculously high, a physically untenable, intolerable level of exhaustion and preparedness, and always being watchful. And she brings in, as a way to help us understand that and see it, I think, much more clearly, she brings in the realities of enslaved peoples on this continent, and the way they were always expected to be watchful and prepared and attending to their masters. And just like we see described here, way into the night and early in the morning, always at beck and call, and always needing to be prepared and ready to handle and manage everything. And it's utterly unjust. It's utterly unfair. It's not a fair. And so there's a critique here of this is how the kingdom of heaven functions. This is how God operates and thinks. Like, I'm pretty sure that I'm comfortable saying that is worth saying no thank you to. So being watchful is one thing, being prepared is one thing. The level at which it's being described in this story and hints at for us what the enslaved peoples in the first century did actually need to constantly be engaging and be prepared to do is what this story, I think, gives a little bit of a voice to. And so that taps into this other entirely different conversation, which is the reality of slavery in the first century, which is that it was much more horrific than most people like to say. So many people today like to make it sound like slavery in the first century wasn't as bad as other instances of enslavement of peoples over the centuries, millennia, and that's just not true. So anyway, so chapter 25, being prepared, the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 virgins took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom, or anyway, they went to meet. Another piece that comes up in Dr. Smith's article, the Reverend Dr. Smith, is that these virgins are being called virgins on purpose. So it's a marriage celebration, right? It's the reception, and they are virgins waiting for the bridegroom because they're kind of, like the part of what's being given to him as part of the wedding. Kind of like Bilhah and Zilpah came along with Rachel and Leah, kind of a thing. It's a really interesting scenario. So things I didn't think about when I was reading these in high school and college. There's a lot more going on here that's unpleasant. So with that in mind about the virgins, I'm going to go ahead and finish reading the story. 10 virgins took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. By the way, I also have a problem with the label virgin, and it's the premise of virginity is based on a violence being done to women's bodies over and over. Like the first time they have penetrative sex, that the premise that a woman will bleed the first time she's penetrated by a penis, for consensual or non-consensual sex is awful. It is that is reflecting a violence being done to a woman's body that does not have to happen. And this concept or construct of virginity as a thing is utterly a construct. It is a full-on example of a construct of men's ideas about women's bodies that just doesn't hold up. So anyway, that's another thing I talk about in my book, by the way. So 5 of these virgins were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. We could get into a conversation about why that is. Did they just not have access to more oil? Blah, 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 right? Anyway, as the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. And you can compare this to the reality of having to be on the watch, even if you're exhausted at the end of the day, right? But at midnight, there was a shout, "Look, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those virgins got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." All kinds of questions run through my mind. Not about not reading with the grain on this one. Anytime women are being critiqued or judged in some way in scripture, I always want to say, yeah, I bet there's a story behind that, why they weren't able to have the oil. Anyway, because that line there makes me think that, like, go get some for yourselves. Like, we got this. Well, then where does yours come from? But anyway, and while they went out to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the other virgins came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "I don't know. Truly, I tell you, seriously, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." And while the premise of keeping awake is something I understand, it's also a premise that will lead to utter exhaustion, burnout, just devastation of your body to be constantly on the watch. Anxiety, stress, all those kinds of things. It's like, yeah, no, not terribly healthy, actually. If you think it's 2 days, in a year or so, even that's just a long time to be on the watch. Okay. So that's it. Those are the stories in Matthew, and there are maybe 1 or 2 in John. So we've kind of covered the synoptics this week in these few days, looking at these passages in Matthew's gospel. We've covered all the ones where Jesus is talking about sex or marriage or divorce and adultery. And one could say some form of, bartering, the gifting of women, virginal women, as wedding gifts. I think that falls into the third category. And there we are. We have a story being told by Jesus or attributed to him where he doesn't seem to have a problem with this reality. And he's using these women and the exhaustion and the extreme situations of their lives to make a point. And yet that whole setting is a terrible setup. It's a terrible framework. And in this case, it's being used positively. This is what the kingdom of heaven will be like. So get your shit together. I would like to give people the chance to say no thank you to that. Okay. Maybe we'll move on and just cover the couple stories from John's gospel so that we've covered the gospels on this lens, this kind of filter that I'm using of sex, marriage, and the abuse of people. So yeah, we'll do that. We'll wrap up gospels and then we'll go back to the Hebrew Bible. Those good juicy stories, difficult stories back there. Okay. So thanks for being here. What about the 32 virgins that Moses gave to God? Long range. I'm not sure that that's a thing in the actual Hebrew Bible. Pablo, we already talked about Matthew 12 a couple days ago, actually. Let me pull that up just so I know which day it is. Hang on. We talked about the eunuchs, and that was, give me a second. Or maybe someone here knows which day that was. Oh dear. I don't remember if that was 2 days. I don't remember if it was the Jesus on divorce and adultery, or if that was why do they keep defining marriage as having sex? Yeah, so it was either 2 or 3 ago, just so you know. Yeah, sorry, it's one of those 2. So, but yes, good stuff. And it is something that is important to me in terms of people understanding what the Bible says about marriage, because Jesus himself is, when people say biblical marriage is about procreation, right? Marriage is for procreation, then I'd like to ask you how in the world Jesus can be endorsing that when he says to go chop off your testicles. He's just not. He's actually challenging that first premise that people think that procreation is for marriage. And there's another really quick early challenge to that premise, which is, we could skip over Abraham and Sarah because people think that they weren't trusting God when they forced Abraham on Hagar. Fine. He is raping her. But also Jacob is having sex with women he's not married to for procreation specifically. So this idea that procreation is for marriage is bullshit. It's not supported by the Bible. That you want to claim that is something different. And I don't challenge what people want to claim. That the Bible supports it? No, it does not. In fact, one of the main patriarchs with his women and Jesus both deny that. So yeah, the eunuchs is really important to me. And there's more time that I could spend on that. But with this lens, it's very important. Yes. I don't even know if I talked specifically when we talked about that, about the fact that I think I probably did, that when Jesus supports eunuchs, right? He's giving two thumbs up to people who at the time were identified, right, as not one gender or another, as what we might refer to as a third gender, or something in between male and female, and that's how people were talked about at the time that way, also quite negatively. And they were also not monogamous or even celibate, but potentially involved in sexual acts with men or women. And I think not that all people who were eunuchs were doing that, but there were people who were doing that, and that was a way that eunuchsism was perceived, even if not all eunuchs were behaving that way. And so to have Jesus referring to eunuchs in the first century, saying everyone who could handle it should do this, it's has really fascinating implications for gender, for affirming something beyond a binary, for undermining the idea of one man, one woman, or that only sex between a man and a woman is approved of by God, because Jesus, according to Christian tradition, is God and is approving of eunuchs who were known to have sex with both men and women. And that was, in fact, why lots of women like to have sex with eunuchs. It's great, birth control. But just because you don't have testicles doesn't mean you're not sexually involved or active. There you have it. Okay. Thanks for showing up. I hope there was something interesting and helpful for you in this conversation. We'll look at a couple more gospel passages in the next couple days, and then we'll be back to Hebrew Bible. And yeah, thanks for being here. Tomorrow, same time, same place.